Benissimo. Microfono. Sì, grazie. Si sente? Bene. Buonasera a tutti, bentornati.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. So we can start our afternoon session by ending the session about the different literatures of Middle Ages. The first lecture of this afternoon will be given by Professor PAOLI, teaching medieval literature. It needs no introduction at the University of Roma II Tor Vergata, where he was director of department. And this lecture concerns one of the topics is an aspect of the topic of saints in early Middle Age. You have the floor. Thank you for accepting the invitation from Cisam. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Cisam for the invitation. It connotes the time of the early medieval saints and not only a kind of paradox highlighted since 1981 by Aaron Gurevich. The saint lives outside of time. He belongs to the world of truths and eternal virtues. And so, he can be connected properly only to the time of the liturgical cycle. For him, on the other hand, the earthly historical world is nothing but a place of temporary and painful permanence, of imprisonment, of pilgrimage to a foreign land. However, it is precisely in a foreign land that he performs his holy deeds. The saint's foreign land is first and foremost the hagiographer's writing, who in his own time tightens the relationship between holiness and temporality in different forms depending on the goals he intends to achieve and the hagiographic genre with which he engages. Of this diversity, difficult to simplify and systematize, I will attempt to give an account on the basis of a selection, I hope the most representative possible, of Vitae, Passiones, and Silogs of Miracula, also with the aim of highlighting how, even through the use of topoi that seem to take away from the narrative's historical geographical consistency, hagiographers, even contemporary with each other, let the present be perceived as a time of saints profoundly different from each other. Constant purpose of hagiographers is to teach how to live in time from an eschatological perspective, turning every moment of the chronos into an opportunity to orient it towards eternity. As Sulpicius Severus declares in the prologue of his Vita Martini, in the words of Jacques Fontaine, one of the texts at the roots of medieval hagiography, the task of the hagiographer is not to hand down the memory of illustrious men, to provoke only the emulation of praiseworthy deeds. The duty of man, he states, is to seek eternal life rather than eternal memory. On such an objective depends the often radical relativization of explicit chronological indications. Indeed, Sulpicius himself, denouncing the impossibility of knowing about Martin what really matters, namely the actions of which he alone was a witness before himself, decides that it is enough to recall only a few of greater importance, describing the saint's conduct vel ante episcopatum, vel in episcopatum. It is thus the institutional role of the Bishop of Tours that constitutes the focus and the main, if not the only, chronological distinction of the life, the scanning of which results from two prepositions, ante and in, before and during the episcopate. It is a criterion destined in itself to simplify the chronological articulations of the biography, so much so that Martin's episcopal election is even simply indicated with the sub idem fere tempus, which moreover refers back to the account of a miracle which in turn occurred non multo post, another prodigious event anchored in the period, intuible but not determined, of his hermetic experience in Liguria. The chronological determination of the exempla that follow one another in the third part of the Vita Martini is entrusted to adverbs and adverbial expressions such as in sequenti tempore, per multus tempus, eodem tempore, quodam tempore, and others very unsuitable for making one perceive the passage of time. The only part of the work in which one senses the becoming is that relating to the antepiscopatum years, from early childhood to youth lived as a soldier through appearing to be a monk. Early medieval rewritings of De Vita Martini also almost completely discolor this canon. Venantius, so from childhood to adolescence, Venantius Fortunatus need only be reminded Martin was a youth scarcely in the tender years of puberty. He covered the poor man met at the gate of Amiens with the white clamors of a soldier, which is worth more than the king's purple. I do not believe that such a reduction can be attributed to the genre of the poem. Venantius, in fact, shows an identical attitude in the prose life of Villeroy of Poitiers, in which, after presenting his childhood nourished from the cradle by a great capacity for knowledge, he immediately mentions his marriage and consequent fatherhood to say how, even more strengthened by a conduct of secular life, he had, by God's will, the charisma of a bishop. Returning to the life of Martin, time does not seem to flow in Alcuin's rewriting either, in which of the events that Sulpicius scanned up to the age of 20 only that the saint florem adolescentiae sue mediolana transeget in urbe is recorded. Moreover, the relevance of time in Alcuin's hagiographic work has been more generally grasped recently by Christian Verar Cosmo, points out that the absence of chronological notations in the York monk's texts is intended to give the exemplarity of a geographic text a timeless value. It is not a matter of historically situating the hero, but of making him the embodiment of typical virtues, end of quote. However, it is not necessarily not to generalize too much and historicize. Claudio Leonardi, for example, recognized in Bede's Vita Cuthberti a structure based on a series of miracles within a precise chronological thread. The fully biographical requirement, absent in the martyric tradition and rarely present in that of monastic and episcopal hagiography, is here firmly maintained, even within the episodicity in itself inexhaustible of the miracle narratives. This requirement provokes the characterization of some episodes by an extraordinary abundance of chronological markers, which allow the reader almost to share in the protagonist's day. It happens, for example, when Bede tells of the bundle of warm bread and meat that miraculously fell from the roof to feed young Cuthbert, who had fasted for a whole day. The succession of seasons of days, also signified liturgically of the hours of the day, turns out to be very detailed. Erat tenim tempus incipientis brume, estate infirmiter posita, ora tertia, odem die non posse finire, etc., etc. None of this is read in the earlier anonymous Vita Cuthberti. So that of Bede is a very aware operation. Bede makes explicit, even in a literally effective manner, that much greater propensity for the chronological arrangement of the material available for an account of the saint's life and virtues that distinguishes many narratives from the Anglo-Saxon era. Such a biographical approach is most evident in the lives of the English missionary saints, which somewhat attenuates the emphasis on asceticism and dramaturgy typical of Merovingian hagiography. A meticulous attention to the chronological placement of events has been emphasized with regard to the vitae of Vilibaldo and Vilnebaldo of Ugeburga, and is particularly evident in the Vita of Willibaldi, half of which is devoted to the account of the protagonist's pilgrimage to the holy places. Mario Danza observes, even in the resumption of the topoi of the geographic genre, Ugeburga does not focus the events from the perspective of the extraordinary and miraculous, but in the sober realism of a concrete and everyday dictate, punctuated in a liturgical year and segmented at times by a deserted and inhospitable nature, or seductive and rich in the triumph of the flowering meadows. In a similar manner, but with an entirely eschatological perspective, the author of Navigatio Sancti Brendani behaves, a text most likely predating the last quarter of the 8th century, now accessible in a splendid edition edited by Giovanni Orlandi and Rossana Guglielmetti. The narrative is almost entirely liturgically paced. Suffice it to recall here a passage from the chapter devoted to the return to the Easter Islands. Go and embark so as to celebrate the Holy Night of Resurrection Sunday, where you celebrated it last year, and likewise the day until the 6th hour. Sail then to the island known as Bird's Paradise, where you were last year from Easter until the octave of Pentecost. I will visit you next Sunday. The author abounds with chronological clarifications, whether is seeking narrative realism or liturgical symbolism, leaving one to suspect at times, as Guglielmetti observes, that is not very adept at mastering the thicket of references thus created, if such is the text he has actually delivered to the page. The different sensibilities of hagiographers and the functions assigned to their texts often make a difference. The author of the writing of Uge Burga's Vita Vilibaldi, almost certainly intended for liturgy, summarizes the protagonist's pilgrimage to the Holy Land in a few lines by means of a long ablative absolute. More than the details of the route, the anonymous epitomizer is interested in Vilibaldi arriving as soon as possible in Bethamar, at the church of St. Matthias, where the pilgrim loses his sight, remaining blind for 2 months. Uge Burga has devoted only a few lines to this episode, but in the rewriting they are greatly amplified in didactic paraenetic perspective. In contrast, the author of the literary writing, most likely from the 10th century, more scrupulously adheres to Uge Burga's dictate about Vilibaldo's pilgrimage, also feeling the need on 3 occasions to specify it on the basis of historical ecclesiastical information gleaned from Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica and the Storia di Partita. Also documenting this orientation are the retouches to Oraterio of Verona's recasting of the life of Urs Marus, written by Anton of Lopes. These are additions that, as François Dolbeau points out, are intended to enrich with historical facts, names of persons and places, a model deficient in documentary terms. Also attributable to the initiative of this same interpolator is the indication of Urs Marus' date of death, complete with year, month, day, and indication. Of similar needs and solution, let's take note the life of Herminius, Urs Mar's successor, due to the same interpolator. Such demands and solutions, however, are entirely minority in the vitae of early medieval saints, whose existence as a rule lasts no longer than the author of Psalm 89:10. The years of our life are 70, 80 for the stoutest. But the historical duration is often dilated upstream by the premonitory dream of the pregnant mother, such that geographically the saint is born before coming into the world, and downstream by the perpetuation of this thaumaturgic virtus, which continues to make him alive beyond death as an intercessor of the living. And there's no shortage of cases in which the saint's birth takes place in the mythical place and on a liturgical significant date, as for example happens to St. Macutius, who was born on the night of Easter Eve in the Lancarven Valley, the homeland of his teacher St. Brendan. As for the ages of life, the one most often mentioned is childhood, which is almost always alluded to through the topos of poor Senex. In the vitae of early medieval saints, chronological references break down the value of time in view of the exaltation of virtue. It happens starting with the Vita Antoni, the archetypal text of the hermit monastic model, in relation to which the long ascetic exercise is central. We read there that Antonius perseverant rapueritia usquat senectudem in sanctitate vixerat, and that after 20 years of solitary life he presented himself to those who sought him with such a physical appearance that he showed no signs of penitential harshness and demonic harassment, but on the contrary his ancient physical beauty was preserved as if time had not passed at all. quasi nihil temporis egisset antiquus membrorum decor perseverabat. Relative to the time of his asceticism, Jerome's Vita Ilionis, another landmark narrative for later geographers, lingers on meticulous temporal details regarding his diet. Between his 21st and 27th years, for 3 years in a row, he ate lentils soaked in cold water, and for 3 more years unseasoned bread with salt and water. From his 27th until his 30th year, he sustained himself by eating field grasses and raw roots. From his 31st to his 35th year, he ate barley bread and unseasoned vegetables, and so on until 63. Then, believing he was near death, from 64 to 80, he abstained from bread, driven by an incredible ardor of soul. The purpose of such a scan, intended to place before the eyes of the reader the severity and perseverance in the exercise of asceticism, is made up of numbers that, with the obvious occurrence of 3 and its multiples, turns out to be more than objectively exact, symbolically perfect. And if at the age of 80, Hilarion believes that the time has come for him to die, it is because he has reached the age that the aforementioned Psalm 89 indicates as the limit. In a similar vein, in Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the hermit Paul, introducing himself to travelers, states, "I have therefore completed 90 years in this island, 30 years by eating fish and 60 by drinking from this spring, while at home I've lived for 50 years. My age to date sums up to 140 years. And now, as I was promised, I must wait here in the flesh for the day of judgment." Relative to the time of asceticism of interest are shown the practices described in Byzantine geography, particularly in the BOE of the Stylites. For example, Alypius, after 53 years in which he practiced stasis by always standing in prayer on the column, stricken with hemiparesis at the age of 85, spent another 14 of them lying on his side until his death in peace at the age of 99. Again, in the age of death, as Francesco d'Aiuto explains, as a symbolic value corresponding to the sum of the numerical values of the letters that make up the word Amen. Alpha with comma 1 me 40 eta 50 ni 899. Equally symbolic is the period of years spent incognito by St. Alexis in his father's house, where he practiced the humblest of trades associated with servitude. The duration of this period, set at 17 years, corresponds to the sum of the two numbers 10 and 7, and examples could be multiplied. The temporal dimension, Leonardi recalled, is usually completely absent in the martyric hagiographic tradition, especially in those narratives that Hippolyte Delay has effectively called epic passions. In them, the opposition between the aeterna and temporalia constitutes insistent subject matter, and the more or less lengthy dialogues between the saint and his persecutor, or in exhortations to conversion and perseverance. Cereale, one of the protagonists of the Passio Getuli, declares, "Iam nos causa malmisimus temporale, mut frua muro eterna," but it is a statement in which the unanimity of martyrs is recognized. This tension towards eternity makes many chronological data superfluous. As a rule, the period in which the event is to be placed is indicated by means of the name of the emperor or local authority that gives impetus to the persecution. In this regard, it suffices to recall the beginning of the Passio of St. Pantaleon. Reigning Impio Maximianus, many Christians, despising this life for the sake of faith in the Lord and in view of his kingdom, were being tortured to death. Then the most holy faith fought through patience, crowning its athletes, and his victory leads to eternal life. As is evident, Maximian is a figure of the present life that constitutes a temporary but long obstacle to the fullness of joy. and his long time is that perceived by the noun patientia, the waiting for the gaudium promised to the faithful servant. To the names of the authorities persecuting the martyrs, the geographers do not assign the function of chronologically setting the events, but the role of antagonists in representing the clash between paganism and Christianity, between ungodliness and holiness, between time and eternity. In narratives in which, as Hippolyte de Hay thought, the protagonists are not persons but types, any historical biographical consistency is necessarily lacking. It is not the age of the martyrs that is relevant, but the robustness of their faith and the tenacity of their perseverance. Agnes states this in front of the persecutor: Fides enim non in annis, sed in sensibus invenitor, et Deus omnipotens mentes magis comprobat quam etates. Moreover, the young martyr, whose infantia computabatur in annis, sed erat senectus mentis immensa, reproposes the poses of the poor Senex, which is also very recurrent in martyric hagiography. In the Passiones, the chronological caesuras, indicated very generically, describe the stages of the trial, the interruptions and resumptions, post dies paucos of the martyrs' interrogations, which are prolonged in order to allow space for the exposition of the truths of faith. Other chronological details concern the prayers of those condemned to death, whose long duration is almost always expressed with the expression die noctuque, or through the numerical perfection of 3. As I mentioned at the outset, despite the almost unanimous use of the same rhetorical structures, two contemporary geographers can make the present as a time of saints, and thus between history and eternity, perceived in profoundly different ways. This is clear from the works of Gregory of Tours and Gregory the Great. Among the geographers, Gregory of Tours seems the most interested in the computo issues. Indeed, in the Historia Francorum, he reports, also quoting Victor Aquitanus, that on at least two occasions in 577 and 590, Easter was celebrated on different dates in the cities of Gaul. As Bishop of Tours, he asseverates the orthodoxy of the solution he adopted on both occasions, noting that both times the fontes Hispaniae, quae divinitus implantur, in nostrum Pascha repleti sunt. The historian alludes to the Illustre Miraculum de Fontibus Hispaniae, on which he expands in the Liber in Gloria Martyrum. The faithful of Osset, near Seville, who had gone to church with the bishop for the celebration of the Easter Vigil, found the baptismal font left empty on Holy Thursday, full of water. The water, which exceeded the edges without falling to the ground, did not decrease in level even when it was drawn with amphora by all present, who intended to use it to bless homes and fields. 3 more episodes concern punitive miracles against those who did not believe in the authenticity of the miracle. Gregory concludes, heretical are those people who, in the face of such mania, instead of believing, continue to question the truth of the divine commandments with the bad chatter of interpretations. In the light of this articulate narrative, one of the longest in the Liber in Gloria Martyrum, the reports on the way of resolving the Easter liturgical uncertainties set forth in the Historia really leave us to conclude, with Arno Bors, that Gregory of Tours did not so much intend to calculate as to tell. However, his need to emphasize the necessity of celebrating Easter every Sunday, a day that marks time in the succession of weeks, seemed clear to me. I believe he writes, in fact, in the first book of the Historia, that the resurrection of the Lord took place on the first day of the week, and not on the seventh, as many think. This is the day of the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, which we call Sunday, precisely because of the Holy Resurrection. This day first saw the light of the beginning, and was the first to deserve to contemplate the Lord, rising from the tomb. Gregory of Tours, for whom Sunday recapitulates all time, from the origin of the cosmos to the eschaton, reiterates the same conviction at the end of the last book of the Historia, where he recounts that in Limoges many were burnt by fire from heaven because they had done outrage to the Lord's day, for they had done their public work during that day. For holy is this day which first saw the light created and shown, made witness the resurrection of the Lord. Therefore it must be respected with all devotion by Christians, so that no public work is done during this time. Even in Tours some were burned by this heavenly fire, but not during the day of Sunday. Easter Sunday and the festivities of the martyrs and confessors are the chronological references that punctuate the hagiographic works of Gregory of Tours, in which very little prominence is given to the biographies of the saints, even those gathered in the Liber de Vita Patrum and Liber in Gloria Confessorum. In the prologue to the Liber de Vita Patrum, Gregory confesses that initially he had decided to recount only the miracles of these bishops, abbots, and eremites, and also a nun, but then he also learned of some of their deeds and therefore changed his mind. Quia sanctorum vita, non modo eorum pandit propositum, verum metiam auditorium animos incitat ad profectum. But the problem arises, should one say life or lives of the saints? According to ancient grammarians, he observes the noun does not admit the plural, and the singular is preferable. He explains, since despite the diversity of merits and virtues, one is the earthly life. This incontrovertible observation runs the risk of somewhat relativizing the variety of charisms alluded to in the concessive positions, the most hypocritical of subordinates, and thus the exemplary efficacy he seems to have set out to achieve. But for him, one is in substance also the perfect earthly life. He makes this very clear when he begins to speak of Lupicino and Romano, New Testament in hand, the good and faithful servants who have merited and deserved to enter into the joy of the Lord, following the Lamb wherever he goes, are those who from the cradle have desired to know the Lord, and once known, have behaved in such a way as to keep the garment of baptism immaculate until death. In this perspective, specifying biographical circumstances even through summary chronological references serves little purpose. However, considering also that the preface of the medallion on Bishop Eligius, Gregory summarizes in 4 lines the geographic specificity of the figure of the confessors. They are those who focus their gaze on the Christ who was born humble, was crucified and rose again. Fulgebat in is et illud resurrectionis lumen insigne, of whom shone the angel who rolled the stone of the tomb, out of whom shone Jesus, who shone suddenly presenting himself to the apostles, and when, after instructing them with the word of life, celesti est vectus in arce. What interests Gregory of Tours is not so much how the story unfolds, but how it ends. This is also proved by the case of Gregory, Bishop of Langres, his ancestor. He died on the day of Epiphany, and is when the day of Easter Sunday takes place, and his beata facies sit erat glorificata post transitum, ut rosis similis cerneretur. It was red, and the rest of the body tamquam candes lilium refulgebat, so much so that you could have thought it iam tunc ad futura resurrectionis gloriam preparatum. As Sophia Pescaianus already noted, the story of St. Eligium is concentrated all in the miracle of the deliverance from the demon of the emperor's daughter, an emperor not even named, proving the relevance of the historical background in the face of the saint's act.
Di fatto, il Liber de Vita In fact, the Liber de Vita Patrum makes another collection of miracles, precisely of post-mortem miracles. For the Bishop of Tours, in fact, more praiseworthy is the virtus that comes from the tomb than the actions performed by those still living in the world, which may be tainted by continuous worldly occupations. Even more tenuous is the link between the time of the saints and that of history in the Liber in Gloria Martyrum, where the interesting phenomenon that Massimo Oldoni observed in the first book of the Historia Francorum, namely the ordinary citation of martyrs and confessors alternating with emperors, is completely absent, almost as if Gregory counterpoints the contribution of Eusebius Girolamus with the unfolding of a new division of ages, represented by the first attempt to propose the periodization of sacred history according to the scanning of the broader diagram constituted by the times of human history. End of quote. In contrast, in the Liber in Gloria Martyrum, the name of the saint whose miracles Gregory reports is never associated with that of the emperor, to whom, on the other hand, he was and continued to be linked in the Passiones, some of which, as he himself declares, were known to him. For the Bishop of Tours, it is irrelevant that the time of history coincides with the time of hagiography. The task of the hagiographer is not to reconnect the lives and deeds of the saints to the past, but to make manifest God's action in the present, especially through the miracles that occur at the tombs of the saints. It is in this perspective that the remote past can, indeed must, be recovered, indeed reread. This is demonstrated, for example, by the pericope of the Liber in Gloria Martyrum, in which Gregory of Tours not only does not mention, as he does in the Historia Francorum, that Pope Clement died during the persecution of Trajan, but recounts the miracle of a low tide as if it had happened for the first time in his own time, nunc, whereas the hagiographer on whom he depends, while guaranteeing that it would be repeated every year, declared it to have happened immediately after the Pope's martyrdom. That nunc makes manifest the overall sense of the hagiographic production of Gregory of Tours, who recounts miracles and stories that do not follow a historical chronological order, being rather linked to the chronological and spatial present, his time and goal. Nuperrimum autem tempore, he recounts, San Genesios manifested himself in Auvergne during the episcopate of Vitus of Vienne, who consecrated a basilica to him and instituted his feast, in qua nunc multa frequentia populorum, veniens cum sanitate regreditur. And God continues to work miracles through the intercession of Saint Martin, who, nunc exornans virtutibus eius tumulum, benefits Christians. Gregory of Tours' time of the saints is the time of the saints' post-mortem miracles for the benefit of, or against, men awaiting the resurrection of the flesh. Also, consolidating this impression is his great interest in the legend of the seven sleepers of Ephesus, summarized in the Liber in Gloria Martyrum, and also popularized in its entirety in a Latin translation to one through which it was spread in the West. The protagonists of the tale, in fact, walled up alive by order of Decius, prostrate only obdormierunt. Under the reign of Theodosius II, the Lord inmisit septem viris spiritum vitae et surrexerunt, believing that they had slept for one night only, and the miracle occurred to counter a heresy that there was no resurrection of the dead. The need to read the present as a time of saints in an entirely eschatological perspective is also programmatically answered by Gregory the Great's dialogues. The Pope's interlocutor, the deacon Peter, asks several times whether saints like those of old still exist, and he himself knows the new miracles occur on the example of ancient wonders, and this happens every day. Many saints, the Pope explains, even if they do not perform miracles, nevertheless they are not inferior to those who did them. And still, very many happen diebus nostris, nostris modo temporibus, nuper usque ad ec Langobardorum tempora. Deacon Peter likes them very much precisely because they are recent. Facta ec placent quia mira et multum quia recentia. Some of these signa are similar to those recounted by Gregory of Tours. They demonstrate that to the Arians, whether Goths or Visigoths, the superiority of the Catholic faith. A few bishops of Gaul, and as also happens in Italy, present themselves as defensor civitatis. And even the Viridae of the dialogues have no biographical consistency. They are identified only as priests, monks, bishops, as happens in the works of Gregory of Tours. However, in south-central Italy, the time of the saints is very different from that perceived in Gaul. The recent saints, of whom the Bishop of Rome writes, exemplify the conviction expressed by his deacon, it is of great edification to our lives to see people performing miracles and to observe the heavenly Jerusalem in the inhabitants of the earth. These people are weak men, also in need of correction, who embody a minute, widespread holiness and become instruments, as Leonardi puts it, of theandry, of a history that already manifests signs of meta-history. They demonstrate these first of all miracles in life. There are no prodigious burials in the dialogues, and the thaumaturgy of the Viridae depends on their sharing, as far as possible, the singular purity and simplicity of nature of Almighty God. It is also the premise of Santolo's sanctity, who saves a deacon from being beheaded by the Lombards, decreed by the Lombards by offering himself in his place. Gregory comments, "We know for a fact that Santolo was not educated. He ignored the precepts of the law, but since the fullness of the law is love, he observed the whole law of love of God and neighbor, and what outwardly he did not know in theory, he lived inwardly in love." Let us compare, if you agree, this ignorant science of ours with his wise ignorance. This our science lies on the ground, while his soars on high. Wise ignorance is another characteristic of Gregory the Great's time of saints, inaugurated by Benedict of Norcia, who was wisely ignorant and wisely uncultured. Absent from the dialogues are the saints accunabulis, those who at the age of 5 are already able to interpret Holy Scripture. Instead, those who, like Benedict and Servan, exchange sweet words of life with one another are very present, and since they could not yet fully satiate themselves with the sweet food of the heavenly homeland, they at least foretasted it with desire. And one night in the Campanian monastery established by Liberius, after the others had retired to rest, Benedict kept watch, anticipating the time of night prayer. As he stood at the window and prayed, suddenly, looking up at the sky in the middle of the night, he saw a diffused light that drove out, above the monastery, all the night darkness, and the whole world, as if gathered under one sunbeam, was brought before his eyes. And fixing his gaze in this splendor of sparkling light, he saw the soul of Germanus, Bishop of Capua, being carried up to heaven by angels in a sphere of fire. This is the same Germanus who is remembered in the 4th book of the Dialogues, as he purified himself of his guilt before entering the endless joy of heaven. The purgatory of the Bishop of Capua shows that in these last times so many things are coming to be known concerning souls that had previously remained hidden, so that these evident revelations seem to bring and manifest to us the future century. End of quote. In the dialogues, dialogy, the present time and the future can be encountered. Gregory the Great explains to Deacon Peter that it is as when the night is about to end and the day is about to begin. Even before the rising of the sun, to a certain extent, darkness is mingled with light. In the same way, the end of this world is mingled with the beginning of the future one, and what remains of the darkness is illuminated by the mingling of spiritual light. The afterlife already occupies history. Joseph Cremascoli observes, all the events of life and the values of the spirit are therefore seen by St. Gregory in the eschatological perspective. In the passage from the dialogues just mentioned, the alternation of day-night is a metaphor for the earthly and afterlife. In early medieval geography, the day-night rhythm turns out to be variously employed. Nights are often inhabited by demons, at least beginning with the Vita Antoni. Quote, at night they made such a noise that the whole place seemed to move. It is a ray of light penetrating through the roof that suddenly makes the demons disappear, and the next day he went out more ready for God's service. Sometimes the night is the time of temptation and sin, as in the case, for example, of Severinus of Septempeda, who one night, while the moon's rays were filtering through as if from a wicker basket, carnally united himself with a woman devil, Aurora Rutilante. He became aware of the sin he had committed and repented. Not infrequently, the night is the time of theft, even of relics of the saints, which is followed by the day of restitution of the ill-gotten gains, even as a result of the performance of punitive miracles. The night is also the time of prayer to implore positive miracles which are fulfilled the next day, as happens to the monks in Jerusalem who have no more grain. Night is especially the time of apparitions and dreams that indicate behaviors to be followed. It finally hosts vision of otherworldly realities, such as the one already mentioned of Benedict, which occurs, though, in tempesta noctis ora, that is, at the moment when, as Isidore of Seville will specify, time seems to stop, in tempesta inactuosa quasi sine tempore. So the vision of the outwardly happens when human time seems to stop. Geographic narratives are also characterized by the instantaneousness-duration relationship, very often employed to describe the dynamics of miracles in narratives of any type. The miraculous event usually occurs instantaneously, mox statim continuus immediately, as a consequence of an action of the saint or his adversary. For Claudio Leonardi, this instantaneousness contributes during the early medieval centuries to making explicit a violent dimension peculiar to the geographies in which, and I quote, the saint is a ruler, a mighty one of God, rather than a friend of God and of men together. End of quote. The immediacy of the saint's action is contrary to the long duration of the negative situation against which it is manifested. In this regard, the detailed enumeration of the time spent by the demon hiding in the idol of Apollo, pulverized by Saint Martina, seems to me particularly effective. It is the demon himself who holds it against the saint for destroying what had been her home for 98 years, 37 under Caesar Augustus, 45 under Antoninus, and 15 under Alexander Severus. However, quite often such instantaneity also characterizes protective miracles, especially those through which the recipients are cured of diseases that doctors long consulted had been unable to cure. Even the impossible chronology reported by the demon expelled from Martina makes manifest the geographic irrelevance of the possibility of measuring the time of the saints with the instrument of man. This is granted by the protagonists of the tale, the Enoch et Elia, datable between the 8th and 9th century, but available only in the adaptation by Goffredo da Viterbo. They believed that their journey to earthly paradise had lasted 3 years, when in fact 300 years had passed. As I recalled at the beginning, Gurievich observed that the saint can be connected properly only to the time of the liturgical cycle. That is so. But paradoxically, this connection is perhaps the most historiographically uncertain. since Baudouin de Gachier, who devoted fundamental studies to the history of the relationship between liturgy and hagiography in the early medieval centuries, very little has been done. And concerning the subject, many aspects have yet to be clarified. When, where, and how precisely did the Legende enter the liturgy? This is yet to be clarified. When, where, and how precisely did the Legende enter the liturgy? It is possible to determine, at least with a good approximation, where and when they became an integral part of the office of readings, and what kind of text precisely were they read. To answer these questions, the generic normative prediction of synods and councils, nor the dictate of the pseudo-Gelasian decree or some testimonies of the 4th, 5th century fathers are not sufficient. From valuable recent censuses of early medieval Latin passionaries, to which Gaia Sophia Saiani has devoted herself, it seems to emerge that it is to Carolingian liturgical practice, and in particular to the 9th century, that special attention should be paid. Indeed, codices since then document the adaptation by compendium of longer narratives characterized by the division into lectiones. It was especially in this way that the time of the saints became the liturgical time. But we need to make the research universal. This overlap, although in less detail, was hoped for by the authors of the historical martyrologies, first and foremost Bede, in whose martyrology he sought to point out scrupulously, as he himself recalls at the end of the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, on what day and in what manner and by what judge they defeated the world. In the monastic sphere, this initiative, like those of those who imitated Bede, perhaps gave impetus to the custom, attested from the end of the 8th century, of reading the martyrology in the Officium Capituli, so that in so great a multiplicity of saints, not being able to recite the office of all of them, at least a brief mention of them may be made. In this way, each day throughout the year, he reproposed to the attention of the faithful episodes of holiness from the geographical and chronological coordinates, of which it was possible to perceive from Christmas Eve onward, one year after another, the intersection of all space and all time as a universal chronotope of grace. Thank you.
Benissimo, ringraziamo.
Well, thank you, Professor Paoli, for this lecture, which seemed to me perfectly balanced in all its components. I mean, personal remarks and also the references to the vast literature that he has definitely read and, I mean, to write this paper. And also taking into account also all the categories and all the temporal categories that he mentioned, the life, death, and also the variety of the different geographical sections, and also the subgenre of the geographical literature. So I hope that this was food for thought for the next, for the debate that will follow. I will now give the floor to Professor Renzo Tosi from the University of Bologna. I think you all know him, or many of you might be familiar with him, especially given his knowledge about Greek and Latin texts. His his paper, Tempus Edax, Proverbs about the weather in the early Middle Ages.
Si vede bene. Va bene. Sì, ringrazio innanzitutto.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation. As the President reminded us, I am a classical philologist, so somehow I am also a little bit embarrassed because I know that here I am talking before I mean, I'm talking about a period which is not precisely the ones I have mostly dealt with in my career, academic career, but I have been invited for what the President has already mentioned. I have studied a lot, quite extensively, basically for 40 years, what is called as the proverb tradition. When we talk about proverbs and tradition, this starts from classical age until nowadays. I have to say that rather than talking about traditional proverbs, we are talking about, if I can start with a short introduction, we are dealing with the general topoi, for example, the translation of life, and we cannot isolate certain images, and within them we can identify single images, such as, for example, a river, or the water of a river as an image, a parallel for the life that flows. And these images can lead to proverbs and then to sentences and several types of topics and arguments until we reach, for example, an aphorism. When we talk about aphorism, aphorism has, I mean, it's quite popular, and the maximum point is originality, because the main point is the originality with which, the peculiarity with which one single author tries to deal with the typical traditional topic. It's a sort of game, you know. What is fascinating for me? Sort of Chinese box. Well, some traditions start from the classical world until current times. This does not mean that we have to think simply about what the anthropologists called something that doesn't change. This or invariance. What is interesting instead is to see the changes, the variations that can occur, which can be usually of two types. One connected to, for example, a single author that usually deals with the traditional expression, which is so widespread that has lost its efficiency, which is why when at some point, as well as for the metaphor, we need to strengthen it by making some variations. The other element, and this is the one on which I'd like to spend some time today, is the variation that occurs due to a different cultural moment and time. My lecture will start from some classical examples of traditional expressions or traditional topoi, which will be reintroduced in the Latin culture and then interpreted or given new vision. The main element of the new element, as far as time is concerned, is what I have already heard being mentioned these days, in these days here in Spoleto, which is to say a sort of tension between what our time, a time which fugit somehow, and a different type of time, a time of eternity, time that should at least wait for us. This tension is something that we perceive quite well when we talk about this topoi. Before making an example, I would like to make a further remark. When these motifs goes from one author to another, and when the author becomes a famous one, the traditional formulation of that author becomes a common one. For example, we all talk about, what does it mean to say woman is a changing one? Why? Because this is a famous Victor Hugo quotation made famous by Verdi. we find some topoi expressed by a Virgilian oration that existed at the time, which collected expressions that derive from holy scriptures, but also authors which were considered first-class authors. This is a difference that we find in the Latin, and we find them in Western culture, and in Western culture we also have, at least in the Western culture, I have never found parallels. Paramiography has its main aim, that of collecting or gathering some expressions and to explain them, also because they have as its main goal that of serving classical texts. These other genre that we have in the Byzantine Middle Age, starting from ancient times, which is extremely flourishing. In Western, we do not have it. We have libri proverbiorum. For example, one is of the Bede, Venerable Bede, and these proverbi proverborum are sometimes a collection of nice and beautiful expressions which have nothing to do with the Byzantine ones. Just to move back, or go back to our simplification, to show you the difference between what I said earlier. So the difference between the topos, classical topos within the culture of High Middle Ages, I would start from a passage of Ovidium, Tempus et Edox. This is a very famous expression, even in modern times, which indicates the time of our life, which is basically eating up everything. If we look at these passages from Ovidius and Metamorphosis, we see that this is juxtaposed, and that there is no solution to old age. It destroys everything. There is nothing that can counter this. This edax is found in the Colombano. I am not able to debate now about the attribution or this type of issues, but what I'm interested into is to look at the mindset, a different mindset. You see, as at some point in these monastici, Rabban Mauro, qui pius et clemens dominus miserebitur illi. You see, at some point there is a different vision, and also in Rabban Mauro we find that pauper tum justus regna superna capit. So next to this time that it's up everything, but eats it gaudiamundi. It doesn't eat it everything. Those who has a specific situation will be able to have a different perception of time, a time which is not a time, in fact. Within this topic, there is also one of the most ancient topoi, which is, as I said, author, famous Pantarei. We are used to use this expression, Pantarei, as Heraclitus one. There are 12 or 13, and in none of that this Pantarei is found, actually. So from a philosophical point of view, it was actually different. There was a contraposition between the idea of a river and the fact that the water of a single river and the water where one was supposed to plunge several times. But as it often happens, what is interesting is that the texts are extracted, and once they are extracted, they have their own life, which is completely different sometimes from the original meaning of it. This happened also with other writings, or from which some expression and proverbs were taken out, and which are completely different from the original meaning. Pantarei is a very famous one to indicate our time, the time of our life, which flows. One thing that I used to repeat is that in the Greek world, it is quite evident and present that the present in Greek times, or in Greek, is a constant moving, you know. The present is something that is not an obstacle, is not a state. Actually, the perfect tense is the one used for present times, for present actions. So Pantarei clearly is taking up a completely different connotation. There is also a specific passage which became famous for the culture of High Middle Ages, which is by Ovidio. Euntanni more fluentis aquae. This is taken several times. If you take the photocopies of what I wrote, you can have a look at what I'm saying. So not always we're talking about time in the classical meaning. For example, sometimes in beat, this concerns music. We know how important this author is for the history of music. Now I would like to move on to Alcuin, who, as you know, was used to endless quotations, especially in his epistole, but this is commonly made to Albanis Vanitatus, and even in this case, Vanitas Vanitatum, apologize, and at some point, the idea of sed confirmate semper amore Dei. And in the Rhetorica, we find often the idea of studying as something that must overcome time. Our time somehow must be able to overcome somehow the fugacity of time, and one of the way to do that is studying. In this case, it's studuis virtutum, cum magnum laudus honore senex. I will talk about this one again later on. Another very famous expression with which this is expressed is the omnia vertetas in Virgil, which, according to him, time of our life takes everything with it.
Come vedete nel passo di Avito di Vienna.
But as you see in this passage, also here we have a union with omnia ferteta. So we talk about si qua in annis viridioribus fuerunt studia literarum omnia fertetas. So we talk about when you're young, and so old age takes it away, as I will say at some point, if I have time and it is not wrong, I say it right away, because there is an expression on which I will go back that comes from Solon, who says that I get old, I learn a lot. And at a certain point I said yes, but many things I forget also. So at least based on my experience, once you become old, this is my experience. But if we see other passages, we find, for example, Rabbanomaurus, nil manet eternum saecula praedereunt, and then we have quite a special reproposition of cunctaque tempus habent, ni solus temporis actor. So there is someone who can overcome this fugacity of time, that is the person who built time, who made time. So there is the time of God, and this is the great thing. So in this field, it becomes important to read a psalm. And also in this field, another ancient topos is taken that many of you probably know, because if you went to classical high school, you will recall Pindarus. In Pindarus, there is the very famous expression which concerns this. So, man is a dream of shadow. So this idea of man as shadow is found in several texts, and in the days which are, but especially the day of man are a shadow. And this is due to a psalm of this psalm. If things are as they are, it's clear that there is this idea of the time that flees, the life that flees, but there is also the idea of something that goes beyond. And so also a verse, an important verse, famous verse by Virgil is taken up. Virgil in two passages, it doesn't refer to the deity, to Christ, or that who performs this action, but this refers to the human glory, which semper onus nomenque tum menesque laderunt is taken several times in this direction, in the Christian, from a Christian point of view. So we have a vision of time which flees, but next to this, our life and the time that flees, there is attention towards another time that we have to orient ourselves to. How can we do that? Through actions that can somehow be seen in they can be seen within prayer, or a relation with the deity, a relation with the other time. So repropose in our fleeing time, that time which is beyond this time, this transit time. But this is also another way to study. We find the study several times, as mentioned, as an element which has to help in especially in the Carolingian time, and especially in Alcuin. Now, So as I was saying, this topos is ancient. There is the Solonian passage that I was mentioning, stating, I get old, I learned several things, but then there are several other passages. It's clear that now I'm just giving some examples. I'm just giving you a selection, of course. If I will prepare a more complete, a longer text, and if there are questions, of course, I will try to be clearer. So the first passage that I mentioned is a very important passage because it belongs to one of those monologues which is really remarkable in the medieval field. These cathodistic are some of the texts which will be translated not in early Middle Age but a bit later. So they will be translated in all vulgar languages and they will be translated by Massimo Pamude in Greek. So they are cathodistics are extremely important. So someone believes it is a Catonian tradition. Personally, I believe they're just like the monastics of Menandros in the East. So some of these texts belong to these authors, but some other texts are attributed, these texts are attributed to these authors just because these authors are the most important ones, so Menander, etc. So the Catholics and Menander's Gnostics are extremely important. They are attributed to Cato, and they are recycled and taken again. So we have this distinct saying, stating, do not stop learning and make your wisdom grow. And then he adds something else. And this is something which belongs to the ancient tradition. Not because you're old, you are wise. No, you must learn. So old age doesn't make you wise. The length of time doesn't give you wisdom. Something which amused me in a very special way is that I found several often quotes of a passage of an author who was not Christian, so Plauto. So the Truculentus. So if we look at the passage by him, we see that it is erotic. So nothing, if you're in love, nothing passes. You can also live 100 years, but you will never learn all the troubles that their love give to them. So it has nothing to do with it. But as you see, I've considered Saint Ambrose and Alcuin because it says he takes the verses by Plautus. So I don't know whether. So I don't believe that in the Western world there was a similar phenomenon that is in the East. In the East, Greek language becomes very rigid in taking up classic models, and this is not the same for the ancient models. In Greek, for example, some authors, some authors, Aristophanes is taken up. Why? Because Aristophanes is a model of good Greek, and so he could be repeated and used several times. So it was not used for its contents, because its contents could not be taken up, but it was taken up for its way of writing. Menander was easier to take up from a content point of view, but this does not happen. Why? Because the tradition said that it was Greek barbarian, and so at a certain point in that same time, several authors are recalled and taken up again. So here we have this quote, which is very amusing. And there is also the idea that time must be somehow given to the study, but that there is also the moment in which this, the moment of relax, we could say. So an expression, a famous expression by Fedor is taken, and so if you always tend the bow at the end, you break it, and so this tension must be released somehow at a certain point. So we do not find this only in the Libri Proverbiorum, but also in another, was very important and was mentioned earlier, and is very important for the history. For this history, so Gregory the Great is very important. We find him also in this author. And then other examples concern a positive vision of the time, also of our time. How? What does positive vision mean? The first example is the one of the topos we know, especially with one expression coming from Aulo Gellium, but which became important because it was the saying of Bernard de Chartres, Veritas filia temporis. I don't believe this is always the truth, but so lies do not last long. So we find this especially in Greek antiquity. We find this expression several times, and as you can see, we find this in Tertullian, in Cato's Distige, and this is an element that we find very often. Professor Guglielminetti yesterday or the other day said that she made a difference between that which is early Middle Age and late Middle Age in these studies. Well, we find this constantly. Also, the facts that these authors are taken up, well, this happens very often in year 1000, but all cultures must be considered in their own dimension. And also, this is taken from different authors in this time. Another positive vision of time is the one about the fact that the things which had a long duration are positive things, are things which have their positivity, which are particularly important. So we find that Bonifacio Magon minds Columbanus take up an element which we find also in De Amicizia by Cicero, according to which friendship is particularly important, must be preserved, especially when it is more aged and ancient, and we find veterruma. So we find this in several authors. Why? Why do we have positive elements also in our times? Well, it would be it will take too long to find all the tradition concerning this point. But any pain, even the biggest, the greatest pain, can be relieved by, attenuated by time. Cicero, Saint Jerome tell us this. The collection of statements which is attributed to a dear author, Publius Sirio, and that we find also in Alcuin. I like this expression stating that time will heal the pain that the ratio cannot heal. So sometimes when we have a great pain, we can try to heal it from a rational point of view, but we can't. Only time can do that. Now, if this is how it goes, it's because at a certain point within the world, within time, we cannot think of a time which is always the same and which goes on in a linear way. There must be, so time must have different moments. What will become post nubila fabus afterwards. So there are some moments which are extremely sad in our life, in time, but there are also moments which after this will be moments of peace and tranquility, which will be able to heal the periods of pain. And it's clear that from this point of view, the cyclical time becomes the most important example. The cyclical time of the atmospheric life, or nights and days, how the day alternates the night. In this way, sadness moments alternate with moments of joy. So in these passages, we have these situations. If we look at these passages in a very careful way, we realize that other elements are taken up, which are very ancient. For example, if you look at the last passage by Alcuin, multi sunt prosperitate amici in adversitate rari, and this is an expression, a traditional expression. So there are several variations on this idea. There are friends who are friends when you, in the moments of in good times, but they become enemies when things get difficult. And so this way of alternating the different moments in time is taken up again, but afterwards another element, traditional element, is taken up. So the rarest things becomes the dearest thing. And also in this case, as you see, there is this and the comparison between looks, so the moments of sun and darkness, day and night, this cyclical rhythm which responds an alternation that characterizes our life. We cannot believe that things are always okay, and we cannot fear that things are always bad. And he concludes, as you can read here. And it's a great wisdom. I'd like to conclude by mentioning some statements of omnia tempus habent. Omnia tempus habent, everything has its own, as its time. Yes, in this moment there are commentaries on the Ecclesiastes, but the expression has its diffusion as a traditional expression. We have already seen that passage by Rabbano Mauro, which is found elsewhere. But to conclude, I still have 5 minutes, so I'd like to show how this traditional expression conjugates and combines with another traditional idea. So the 143 Omnia Tempus Habent by Alcuin, and there is something which is extremely traditional and which is connected to it. Posterior ora quod prior non poterat. So this is an idea which we have several times in antiquity. The idea that somehow we must never despair, because just 1 hour can give us what the whole life has not given to us. A single hour, but also the opposite, a single hour can take out everything that life has given us. But there can always be this possibility that the following hours gives you what the previous hour has not given you. And here I draw different quotes. So to conclude, I'd like to conclude with 2 elements. First of all, if we carry out this type of study, as I was saying, I believe we cannot stop by saying that everything is the same. Variations are extremely interesting. And if we analyze this period, if we study this topoi, that can so one can say this is not profound literature, there are other texts, etc. Well, from this very precise idea that there is a continuity compared to what existed previously, and a diversity in continuity. So a new way of looking at things, a new way which we can very often see in authors such as Augustine, Jerome. In Augustine takes up expressions which are typical of the classic world with completely different meaning. Omnia vincitamur comes to my mind, or amori in Augustine becomes something completely different than what Virgil thought. And then there are also other, in this history of church, we have other passages which are taken, but this is extremely interesting. So if this is true, the study of Proverbs, and let me conclude by saying something in favor of these studies. The study of these Proverbs, this type of studies, to look for traditional expression and see how these expressions, these statements get to our days. Of course, these are difficult texts. Of course, every time we start these studies, we realized that there are several things missing, more than the things that you said or that you did. But I believe that this is that we must not abandon the study of the traditional expressions, and we must not be naive in doing that, and we must not be a bit superficial. We have to study the text well. We have to start and carry out a profound study. So let me conclude by saying all this in favor of a study which was the focus of all my life. Thank you. Very well. Thank you, Professor Tosi, for accompanying us in these topics that we cannot often analyze, and so the border between so all these proverbs and the traditional expressions you mentioned. Thank you also for highlighting the importance of the Greek and Byzantine world, which within this context are extremely precious. And thank you for mentioning several times the importance of variation compared to things which are always the same. And in the case of Alcuin and Rabanos, so you told us it is very important to observe not that which is an expression of continuity, but that which changes over time. Thank you. Now we have a 15-minute break as usual, and we resume in 15 minutes.
suoniamo il campanellino per fare... Mi sa che fuori non si sente. No, vabbè, sono 2 minuti. Ecco, quando chiudono. Benissimo, vi ringrazio.
Well, let's resume. We can. The last lecture was the section, the concluding section concerning literature. We will start now with the Robertis, which is particularly sacred, the time in writing, and I was particularly pleased when the scientific committee decided that the person who was most appropriate to discuss this topic was Teresa de Robertis, who is a colleague I've been knowing for a long time, and I remember we were working together when we were both doing a PhD in Florence. The title of its lecture is the time in writing, and I now give the floor to her. Well, I am very honored for the invitation, and I hope that I will rise to the expectations. I have prepared some photocopies that you should have received, which can be used to integrate the presentation and the PowerPoint. The topic is, the theme is abstract, as you said, and I tried to make it quite, more tangible. The formulation, which is so broad, requires some clarifications. Given my expertise, the discussion will concern only Latin writing, and it will focus on the world of the book, excluding a priori 2 important categories of evidences, documents, and inscriptions. These are very important for the knowledge with those who read and those who write. The problem with the relation with time is somehow when we talk, the area will be mainly predominantly Italian. There are chronological limits which are consistent with the corporate name of the site in which we are located, although some mention concerning the Middle Ages, even if only in a comparative function, will be inevitable. Having said that, you might wonder why this image, which is seems to be out of context. I think it's a sort of warning sign to say that this is a very rare representation of the instruments of sandbox. But with that, with this image, we have also writing image to the patients that usually is required to write. As I said, this mirrors the manuscript, the feeling that I try to describe. I have to warn you that the interest for the temporal dimension is far from new in paleography, at least starting from the very first collection of Wattenbach and other important speeches delivered during the 10th colloque of the Comité International de Paléographie Latine, which was held in Erice in 1993. From these last works, 20 years have passed, which means that maybe some expectations might not be, might be different, but when we talk about these, some documents might be accessible, and given the limits that I have mentioned, they are not too abundant either. This is something already that we should think about. In what terms is it possible to talk about the relationship between time and writing, and especially on the basis of which data? There are at least 3 possible declensions of such relation. The first and the most immediate, even trivial, but which, I still want to mention, it's the chronological one, which is to say, to what extent does the writer or his client aspire to place the object of his work or his own performance on the axis of the absolute chronology. And there is also a physical declination, which involves the space-time relationship. In sports, we might say of performance, to which economic time factor management strategies are linked. The data are those expressed in or from the manuscripts, thus not external, so to speak, extragraphic sources. There is also a fourth possibility when looking at time and space relationship, and I decided to leave it out because it insists on, it concentrates on the technique of writing. So the process of building, literally creating the letters that we usually recognize as static images, whereas they are instead the result of a process that places in order signs as segments according to a non-arbitrary time. This is an important aspect from the paleography point of view that touches upon the evolution of science, but this is something that cannot be considered only for Middle Ages, which is why I have decided not to talk about it. So let's move on to the topic. One cannot escape the contradiction that runs through the field of writing throughout its history as to its relation to time, understood in the declination that I have defined as the most taken for granted, the one to which more attention is usually paid for, which is to say the chronological dimension. This is a contradiction that opposes, on one hand, documentary evidences so deeply bound to the temporal dimension, I would say far beyond normative prescriptions, even, although they exist, as a simple awareness that only an orderly succession of facts is the best protection of rights, which is to say, of justice. This contraposition, as I said, between the world of document and, on the other hand, the world of the book, which is so resistant and for a long time to welcome to accommodate explicit references to the time when a work was accomplished or began. A contradiction that is all the more dense in meaning when we find ourselves in the stores of a scribe, and the cases are not lacking, either in the High Middle Ages or later, active on both sides, who does not apply to the book what he knows, and thus in the document. As may be the case with at least one of the various Wolfcots, attested as a writer of documents in Senegal. The one to whom we probably owe a paper drafted Die Mercoris decimum calendas Marti regnante domino nostro Ludovico, which is to say Wednesday, February 19, 822, and who, with the limping hexameters, attest that he wanted the Senegal Codex 20 without giving any chronological reference. The same opposition is found with another kind of evidence halfway between the two traditions and in its material nature closer to the document than to the book. In none of the original missives written within the 11th century and published in the series devised by Armando Petrucci is a date expressed, perhaps because the sender felt that he shared the same time frame as the addressee and was aware of the limited temporal projection of the interests that the letter carried. The Senegalese example, which is found in other documents, such as the one that you can see here, coming from the archive of Pomposa. This is something that took place also later on in the Middle Ages. In Bologna, in the State Archive, there are boxes filled with wonderful papers with wrappers concerning blood events that happened in Bologna, with the witnesses called to testimony before the judge, and each of them has a date with no month. So simply the month and the day, but we do not know the year in which these events took place. In fact, probably there was no trial after. Immediately after. So the Senegalese example, which is likely to be repeated for all those realities in which books and documents are produced locally, is already enough to announce a phenomenon whose exact dimensions can be appreciated statistically thanks to the data inferred from a tool with which paleographers and codicologists have long been equipped. And I am referring to catalogs that published since 1959 and still being published. These are the data you will find summarized in the two tables in the dossier provided. In the first of these two tables, you can read the chronological distribution of everything that has entered with criteria, and I must say that which are not homogeneous, into the 78 volumes published so far in the various national series. The number of manuscripts is quite important. I mean, 78. A chronological distribution that is not indifferent in relation to the discourse of interest here. From the table, you can, it can be deduced that the total of dated, let's say, manuscripts represents 7.3% of the total. I say that we can understand that because there are disturbing factors that intervene and that make the sample not entirely truthful. One, because some of these series is also a document, a manuscript that only contains the name of the copyist, and secondly, because in other cases the very parameter was interpreted in a broader way, more broadly, considering that the day. Looking at the table, one immediately notices that Italy, with the highest total number of census manuscripts, has only 65 manuscripts dated within the 12th century, compared to 300 in England, 310 in England, and 700 in France. This scenario, which could open to the most diverse assessment concerning the diffusion and weight of written culture in the three national scenarios, does not correspond to actual reality. Already in preparing the first volume of the French series, in fact, the editors of the enterprise sought to correct what loomed as a distortion of the corpus, not in line with the stated enterprise sought, or the purpose for which the series was designed. So, faced with the realization that with strict selection criteria for the highest period, up to precisely the whole of the 12th century, the number of codices included in the catalog would have been very low. And it was decided to include also other codices that could be placed by various means, including through data not expressed by the manuscript within a rather broad time span. In a nutshell, if French publishers had adopted as a selection criterion that of explicit ad annum, dating for the 6th, 12th centuries, only roughly 60 manuscripts. I have written down the numbers, so 2 from the 8th, from the 10th, 4 from the 11th, 52 from the 12th. These data, in this case, are far more aligned with the Italian ones. Okay. Let's move on to the second table. Before examining a few concrete cases that at this point is mandatory. Why does a manuscript bear a date, and why so few manuscripts dated in the upper Middle Ages, and then the explosion in the later, notably in the 15th century? The second table breaks down the information related to the quality of the datum, which is to say the elements that are part of the formula of signature and or dating that made it possible to accommodate a manuscript within the still ongoing series of dated manuscripts of Italy. Such a breakdown allows us to see clearly that fixing the moment of the writing of a book is little felt in the High Middle Ages. We have 12 cases in all, and I'm referring to Italy only. While the signature is something that is more relevant. The signature as an affirmation of the self, albeit often compressed, depotentiated within formulae, humilitatis, devotionis. We have 12 manuscripts dated and 47 cases in which we know the name of the copyist. One might object that the manuscripts in which some chronological reference appears are few, because there is a little of High Middle Ages remaining in our libraries. But this is not the case. Or rather, the manuscripts dated within the 12th century are indeed few, but the figure should be read in relation to the totality of surviving manuscript from the same century, not in relation to data from later centuries. And the comparison is well made for those very consistent funds which belong to an institution of ancient foundation, the same one for which the codices were copied and preserved them down the centuries, such as the two you see took into account the Biblioteca of Pistoia and Cassino. Let's look at Monte Cassino. Those dated from 15th century are 13 out of 16, which means 81%. Those dated from the 11th century are 1 out of 10. Not to mention the archives of Pistoia. The reading of the colophons of the 12 manuscripts that I have reported in the copies that I have handed out helps you to identify the occasion for which it seemed important to copies or patrons to fix the time of the setting up of a book. With the only exception of colophon number 6, all the others are presented as very articulate and solemn texts and expressed in a language that adds the formularity of the document to that of the epigraphic, with the date almost always in the exodium position. This is what happens in 5 out of 12 cases, that those two, document and epigraph, is also evident that these models, the two underlying models are those document and epigraph, which is also evident from the way in which these memoirs were concretely realized, either by layout or by choice of writing. In Padua, for example, or in Cremona. This is the Cremona ones with alternating lines, red or black, or the choice by choice of writing. The example of Monza, where it seems like a deed at the notary, or, as in this case, this is in the first page. This is the first page. In all these cases, these texts are comparable to acts of oblation, donation, inter vivos, when not of dedication, not unlike those referring to altars, chapels, gifts, or furnishings, etc., or the foundation of a library, in the case of Cassinesians, in which the dating formula is followed by the list of books commissioned by Abbot Theobald. This is the manuscript of Cesena. I am showing it to you just because it's beautiful, but it's not really readable. In the Codex of Subiaco, Datazio introduces the Liber Vitae, which is a text in which chronology, its very essence, its primary reason, which can also be said for most of the other manuscripts, apart from number 2, 3, and whose content is marked according to liturgical time. To emphasize the non-random connection between the date of the book and the nature of its contents, it may be added that of the only 9 codices dated antiquiores, which is to say prior to the year 800, surveyed by law, contains the so-called Chronicon of Fredegarius. 2 are collections of conciliar canons, and a 4th one is a collection of leges copied by a certain Vandalgarius, maybe, and if so significantly, a notary, judging by the signum accompanying his name that you can see in the bottom at the bottom of the page, which has been somehow ruined by the former Sam Gallius and Vaticana, which are usually placed in remote places or places where they shouldn't be kept. So in order to assess the physical dimension of writing. And when I say physical, I mean a literal meaning as a space-time relationship where space is that of the page and the time is that the time necessary to fill it in is made quite rare in general for if we consider the formularity. None of the Italian examples presented allows one to measure the productivity of a copyist. On the other hand, these formulas or any rate more elliptical annotations of copies are the only sources available. With all this that of the miserability of the time required to set up a manuscript, this is a topic of great interest, even for the audience which is less accustomed to dealing with this particular category of objects. Indeed, it is a common intuition that the intrinsic value of the manuscript book is also linked to the time invested in its production. Thanks to a small handful of subscriptions, Vattemak had already dealt with this subject in his time, but it was also Peter Gumbert in the mentioned conference of 1993 to take up the question again on the basis of a much larger number of news obtained from catalogs of dated manuscripts, but without the data of the 34 volumes of the series Manoscritti dotati d'Italia. And an important update came from the thesis of a student of mine who collected and elaborated all the copy intervals inferable from the copy subscriptions. So I declared those declared in the form, I started on such and such a day and finished on such and such a day, indicated in the table as type A, and those that are derived at the price of inevitable forcing from two successive dates. I finished the first text on such and such a day, and I finished the second text on such and such a day. And by doing so, you can see the intervals. As you can see, only one early medieval manuscript is indicated to represent the case, albeit with some inconsistency, because the time span indicated is not the corresponding one. The manuscript is this one that you can see here, which contains Boethius. These are the results. On one hand, you have the average of the entire sampling that my student analyzed, and on the other, the average of the manuscript of Bern, and you can see that the manuscript has copied 1.20 paper per day, which means that it's going quite slowly compared to the average of other manuscripts, which is 2.38 papers per day. If you look at this, the number is higher compared to the letters of the entire sampling. This is one way of measuring the productivity, perhaps the only one with which you can measure the productivity. But for higher Middle Ages, we are not able to do otherwise. There are two other manuscripts, Manuel Diaz y Diaz, and then John Dezen, have put value on the intermediate dates expressed, and that mark a segment of the manuscript in the Real Accademia della Historia of Madrid, and which allow us to follow the progress of the work of the copyist who signs himself and is called Motarrafe along a 9-month time span. Falling into the category of type B intervals, you can see the intervals that can be found in this manuscript, and looking at the type B intervals and being in some cases very close, these dates allow us to measure the speed of transcription more accurately than the simple and the undeniable general average of 2.24 columns, which is to say more than one facade per day. The intervals show that the pace was, as might be unexpected, that, for example, between October 15 and 23 was much more intense, amounting to 5.5 columns per day or 2.7 sites per day. A true chronographic virtuosity combined with observational skills enable Jean Vezin to trace the date of one manuscript. It's a number 3 of the photocopies that is not dated, but that once the arcane was discovered, turns into a case similar to the one just seen. And the discovery consisted, first of all, in having understood that the dots, I hope you can see them, numbers from 2 to 7, which for 232 times appear in the lower margin of the page, and which are the references to the day of the week.
2 dots Monday, 3 Tuesday, etc. And this has nothing to do with the content. And then, based on the indication of the number of the day and the month, which appears in some folios, the only possible sequence of years to which the various dates refer. Thus, it turns out that the copies carried on the transcription of the 254 folios, to put it mildly, quietly along 6 years, without writing on Sundays, because the isolated dot indicating Sundays is missing, and never on holidays, with a very irregular internal productivity, I mean in the individual intervals and with long breaks. Yet, in all this, with the need to leave a trace of the passage of time. The dates seem to serve to certify not the skill of the copyist, but to extol the long journey, the dogged constancy over time, and so the fidelity to the task undertaken. So if this is the case, maybe we must admit that the performative perspective is not as fundamental to the mentality of the higher centuries of the Middle Ages as it will partially become in later ages, for reasons having to do with the increased demand for books and with the arrival of new categories of writers. Yet codicological or even textual data seem to say otherwise. If in the analysis of a manuscript we find in situation which is schematized here, that is that to a fascicle or groups of fascicles corresponds the intervention of one end, and that the ends are all contemporary, we are authorized to think that the work of transcription was carried out from a model fractioned into its fundamental units, the fascicles, distributed among an X number of copyists who are likely to work in synchrony. I say likely because in principle we cannot rule out the possibility that multiple coeval hands might succeed each other in diachrony, while each remaining confined within a fascicle, though we would have to understand why. There is a case of books copied in this way large enough to configure a well-established system, at least in early Middle Ages. And it is characteristic of this time. In these codices, together with the lesson of the antigraph, other part of its fascicular structure is also transmitted. Here you can see on top, and you also see it in the photocopies, the structure of Raterio, Lorenziano 6319. How to measure the reduction in copying time, assuming as a unit of measurement the amount of time required to make a fascicle. It is evident that if the work had been done by a single copyist to copy the entire Laurentian 6319, so 27 fascicles, it would have taken 27 units of time, whereas with the distribution of the fascicles among several hands, just over 8 units of time, equal to the number of fascicles copied by B or D hands. A case of probably greater interest is Reginense Latino 732, because the antigraph of it has also been preserved, and this makes it possible to verify how the pattern was distributed among the copists in order to speed up the transcription. And so we see that the model was divided in groups of 9 and 10 fascicles, and they are divided in segments of 6 or 7 fascicles with a recurring scan of 4 quaderna plus a final ternone plus, and so this happens for the copies Aldo, Anso Aldus, Frede Jesus, Diodegrinus, etc. So this gives you an idea of the relation between the two manuscripts and for how much material has been saved, but also how much time has been saved if we think of the commitment necessary for the operation necessary to work on the fascicle, the binding, etc. So these cases are just two among the many possible cases of a practice that is typical of the early medieval world, but there is limited replication in the later world. Why is it typical of the early medieval world, this practice? Why is it so typical? Because of a very clear reason. Because such a realization presupposes the contribution of several people working side by side in the same place, sharing the same graphic education, so that the result, despite the participation of many, is graphically uniform, with barely perceptible differences between hands. But these working conditions, when the book production moves to secular workshops, I'm talking about workshop, but I don't even know whether this workshop existed, are lacking, nor are they replicated in industrial type ateliers such as that of Vespasiano da Bisticci. The only case comparable to those we have seen is given by the Visconti Chancery. So as you can see, it is a different Middle Age. But so in this, a team of copyists under the orders of Pasquino Capelli works to give Coluccio Salutati copies of two very important Ciceronian manuscripts. Out of the two, the most interesting case is that of Laurenziano 49:7, which contains the Familiare by Cicero, because it is a copy which was executed with the system with 4 chancery copies, but also because we have the ancient model of this manuscript, a manuscript coming from the Arch, which at the end of the 400 came to Lorenzano. So this is not enough. Something that has to be highlighted and which concerns the rational use of time is that the copies from Milan, in order not to have problems and to be faster, realized a loyal transcription line by line. A line of the copy corresponds to the line of the model according to a procedure which doesn't have many connections with the early Middle Age, but still it has some elements. So to summarize and to conclude, for all early Middle Age, and so also for 200, at least for Italy, the habit to set the date of the setup of a book is not so widespread, except for some cases. Secondly, the speed of writing doesn't seem to be a value, and the capacity, the skills of a copyist is not measured in this. But still, we can see some strategies for the reduction of the transcription time. So, for the all early Middle Age, we cannot expect anything so detailed as the subscription you see, which is also cut. A subscription which will be preferred by every copyist. So the copyist say their name when they copied the manuscript, but also connect them to their genealogy, to a time which dates back to 12th century, because that Pannocchia Riccomanni that you see in this genealogy is a famous figure, and these memories were recalled by Castellani, and the sister of this Pannocchia the brother, of Pannocchia Riccomanni, named Labo, married the sister of Dante. Thank you.
Grazie moltissime a Teresa De Robertis.
Thank you so much, Teresa De Roberti. You presented a wonderful and precious lecture which shows the need of Spoleto, of our settimana, to provide data, well-known data, but also new research, new pieces of research, and information which can really enrich our studies. So now I'd like to invite the previous speakers, Professor PAOLI and TOSI. You can come here on stage for the discussion. I remind you that if you are in if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and those who are in the lodge, well, you have to come downstairs. Thank you.
Benissimo, aspettiamo, ecco, che il professor Tosi ci raggiunga. Venga. Ecco, ora sono tutti qui esposti come San Sebastiano.
So they are all here. So we start with the lecture from Professor PAOLI. If you have questions or remarks, we have great experts of geographic literature. So if you want to give your contribution, of course, we will welcome them. Anyone? I cannot see well. Otherwise, while Lemuri was talking, is a great friend of mine. So some connections with the other lectures came to my mind because you touched upon several points which have already been dealt with by other colleagues, such as the interest of Gregory of Tours for calculus, Vittorio from Aachen. So the legend of the seven sleepers, which has been mentioned in the lecture on theology, indicated some situations which are less standardized and which connect fables with the geography. So the suspension of time. Do you know of other cases in which the passage of time is connected to the biblical episode "Stop the Sun"? And in this episode, how is it enhanced by Gregory? Do we find it in other texts? Well, I believe that the archetype in Jacques' proto-gospel, when Jesus comes to the world, the time stops. And this is something I really like, because when I was a child, it's like that. And so they express the concept which the author of the proto-gospel says, bring bread to the mouth, but then it got interrupted, so time stops. So to what extent proto-gospel takes information from previous times, well, this is difficult to say, but it seems that the legend of the seven sleepers, well, the origin of it is from Middle East, and Gregory of Tours, as Nanni Orlandi wrote in a note to his book, goal is a mix of Eastern origin traditions. And so also Gregory says, I translate the text interpretante zero. So what does it mean? There is a zero which probably translates, so Gregory translates from Greek, but it was a translation probably from Syriac, and so the issue is very complicated. Of course, the legend of the seven sleepers, and well, the colleague who deals with Islamic traditions and more. And so the sleep of the seven sleepers is equal to 309 years. When he goes to the Melchizedek, and so 309 years, and 309 becomes a kind of archetype, the awakening of the seven wise men. So it indicates a whole set of religiously significant elements, so a religiously significant chronology. But establishing a limit between anthropology and somehow literature becomes complicated.
Credo che Gregorio di Tours veramente questo suo grosso.
I believe that Gregory of Tours, this great interest he had for the date, has some well, for him, the main date is Easter. For Gregory of Tours, this was the important date, and I don't think that historiography really dwelled on that. If I can ask you an opinion, on the observation that in Gregory, Gregory tries to alternate the names of martyrs and emperors. Do you think it is a voluntary strategy by Gregory? Do we find it in other texts? Well, in the Historia Francorum, yes. I mean, in the first book, the emperor starts with the apostles, and so in the first book, it is the history which is so the post-Christian history, because it starts from Adam, and so history is represented in this way. But then this criterion is abandoned because he prefers the two lovers of Clermont to what happens, and luckily for us readers. But in the story, yes, but in the hagiographic books, it never mentions emperors. I mean, references are not referred to the past. So Gregory II has no interest in remote past. Okay, thank you. Do you have other questions for Professor Paoli? Okay, no questions. So, Professor Renzo TOSI, Proverbs, traditional expressions. So, if you allow me, I have a request for information, which we started during the break on the medieval repertoires of Proverbs, especially Walter and Otto, and how this material is handled. I didn't mention Walter's reports, even though I included some passages in this in my draft, because it is actually difficult several times to understand what is Walter's source. I mean, in some cases, Walter indicates the source from which the expression, the proverb, comes from. In other cases, they are codices, and this is okay, because if these are codices, we know the age, and someone might say, but this codex is the copy of a previous codex. Okay, but we have that date now. It's just like when they tell me about the medieval fables. So they say, oh, maybe the source is more ancient. Yes, for sure, but this is the date we have. These are the codexes that we have. So in these cases, that's okay. In other cases, Walter takes up a tradition which starts from first humanism, the adagia. This is a very important tradition for modern culture and contemporary culture. And I have to say that especially for British culture, these adagia are the source of a whole set of expressions which become traditional in the culture. For example, homo homini lupus is not an invention by Hobbes, as many people believe, but it will come from Plautus, but through the Erasmus adagios. It doesn't take up the adagios and so the proverbs from Erasmus, but the version which had been done after the Concilium of Trento and which had been entrusted with to the son of Manutius. And so this edition, which had been purified, let's say, from some scandalous saying, is the one which is used by Walter. But in the case of Erasmus Adagia, the source is classic, it's not medieval. He talks about medieval proverbs, but in that case, very many cases it's not. And then he includes in alphabetical order several expressions, other expressions which come from other collections of proverbs which come late, and in several cases we find vulgar expressions which come much after the medieval time. And so I often mention Walter, maybe in a critical way, but I had not conceived this situation based on which we have to say that it is we need to be very careful when we deal with this text. For example, when he mentions the collection of Hiller was someone who in the 16th century translated beautiful Greek expressions, and these beautiful Greek expressions were translated by him, and so the 6th century, sorry, and so it becomes difficult to mention them. In Otto, well, the situation is different because we have a collection of Latin proverbs, and as for the Medio-Latin world, as for the early Middle Age and Middle Age, we have to say that Otto is not so important, but the supplements to the of Otto that were collected by Osler and then published by Gesellschaft, and in that case we have a lot of elements, and in these additions. And then if we of course we have to make some research, and as you know, also research on a computer have evident defects, because you take the passages where you find a specific word, but if there are some formal variations, very strong formal variations, they do not replace the interpretation that you have to make. And so if you want, you must have a general framework somehow. Thank you so much for this clarification. Of course, as the professor said, we must not neglect this literary form, which is a very, very precious link with several anthropological elements, narrative archetypes, and expressions that we use still today, and which are neglected in medieval times. So do you have other questions for Professor Tosi? Yes, may I? Okay, of course. In these examples you gave, I don't see the occurrence of the name of Isidore of Seville, and I think that Isidore collected, but this is my opinion, and it might be not true. So I imagine that Plautus, well, some metamorphoses can already be indicated in Encyclopedias collections, anthologies. So I don't see his name, and I have the suspicion. Well, Isidore's collection is very precious. It's a very precious text that must always be taken into account, because it is a great point of transition. And I didn't mention his name because while I was studying, analyzing the text, well, in these cases, I didn't find him, but of course, his text is one of the greatest texts. So actually, he was there. I sneakily included his name. His work is one of the main collectors. And of course, after him, there will be other collectors, and well, he's the main one anyway. I thank you for. Well, actually, I didn't find this in Isidore, but I have to make more research, because in Isidore there isn't this expression, this formulation, but there would be a different formulation. But thank you so much, because that right comicus really surprised me. This quote by Plautus, comicus, well, for Alcuin, could not be so authoritative. So many expressions like this come to the authors thanks to these collections. I was saying this to one of you. These collections are used with the same ideas that Plutarch was mentioning when he said, well, this can be useful. And yes, this can be useful. Everything can be useful. So that quote, I believe, comes from Isidore Comicus. So I don't know, maybe.
Adesso lo andrò a vedere.
But I will make more research. Thank you so much for this suggestion. Do we have more questions or remarks on the second lecture, Professor Tosi? If not, we can discuss the lecture by Teresa De Robertis.
Domanda, prego, Roberto, scusa.
Yes, we do have a question.
Grazie tante. Vorrei intanto ringraziare tutti e tre i relatori.
I'd like to thank the three speakers, and I have a question for Teresa De Robertis. But first of all, I'd like to say something on what has just been said on the sleepers of Ephesus, for the possibility of assessing the different things. A research project is about to be established of cataloging and study of all the versions of the Seven Sleepers, coordinated by an Arabist colleague. I will deal with the Persian part, and so maybe next time we can discuss this project. As for the lecture by Teresa De Robertis, I believe that from a methodological point of view, it's been very interesting to listen to your to your lecture, it would be nice to apply this method to the Arab manuscripts, but they are too many. They're not well cataloged. But I said this because it was very interesting. So I'm sorry I asked you a question on what you said you would have not said. When I was talking, I talked about the problem of the calamus, the symbology of calamus, and the symbols of the writing, the symbols. So this is a very relevant topic for what I was mentioning yesterday, but also for theoretical and practical matters which are dealt with in Arab literature. So I'd like to know whether in the future there would be an analysis on this aspect, that is the speed of writing the calamus, etc. What you found, what you analyzed. Well, this is a topic which is central in a paleographic and Latin reflection, and it's been so for several years now, starting from the studies by Jean Vallon, who at first tried to rationalize the analysis of the writing by proposing some parameters of observation on the basis of which the writing could be judged. On this, a debate opened with crossed Latin paleography for that moment up to recent years, because in the collection of studies in the honor of Albert de Roulet, there was also an intervention by Stefano Zamponi on this problem. So let's say we can find the most recent reflection there. I didn't deal with this topic because in that case we deal with the evolutionary mechanism of writing. So the moment in which we start to reflect on the times of writing connected to the execution of science, I should have dealt with details that probably nobody would have been interested in, and most of all, they are not describable to a specific time. So how they used to write in early Middle Age, I should have had to study from Roman age and continue for analyzing different problems and the different times. So this is a theme I'm very interested in. I dealt with a topic that I'm sure you will be very interested in, because you know this graphic culture. So I dealt with the binding theme of concerning the bindings in Middle Age. So this is the only real name in which we can expedite the writing, the script. And so I studied binding starting from Roman age. I tried to identify some rules through which this mechanism takes place, especially to counteract that idea based on which everything happens through a spontaneous mechanism, a spontaneous modality which is not regulated by rational laws, but on the contrary, that's a rational system which depends on the structure of the letters. So it cannot be done if some conditions are not met. And I recall that, I don't remember the name, but a colleague of mine was working on this, a colleague who was an expert of Arab scripts. So in that case, this problem was evident. So I'm sorry, but I should have had to explain technical details which I could not include in a specific period of time. Thank you so much. This was very interesting, but my question was another one. I wanted to understand whether in your paleographic studies you found reflections on the relation between calamus, etc. I'm sorry, they overlap when they speak. So this is the problem of all of us. We do not have many sources that can give us information about the scripts. So there are some reflection only when the script end. So the masters of the 500 say something on this. And then there is a treaty of the beginning of the 15th century, which gives some reflections on this, on how letters are connected, etc. But there are not many sources. The sources are scattered, and we work without knowing what people thought at that time. The only thing I can say about this treaty of writing of that century, which was published on historical magazine founded by Petrucci, Scrittura e Civiltà, by Françoise Gaspari. So we, for once, we were satisfied because we identified in cursive script two links among the letters which were found well defined in this treaty. So a posteriori, we had the confirmation that our thoughts were actually working. Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. Professor De Robertis explained why that part could not be dealt with today, but I remind you that there would be the acts of the conference. Of course, I can explain in more details the reasons. Massimiliano Bassetti, you have the floor. Thanks to Teresa, because she gave us a great example of lecture full of insights which concern a lot. And so I have a question on which I do not know much, and so I'd like to know something more from you. So given the rarity of occurrences of dated codices in early Middle Age, it seems to me that this Macrodensis Codex is very interesting, with this kind of itinerary operated by this copyist. From this Motarafe, you were mentioning potentially Arab. Yes, it says it. So I wonder whether these connection with the beginning and the end of the script, whether there was a different cultural education. So the case of the Bible of Tabari comes to my mind, where an Arab Christian who writes in Arabic but also in Greek includes a lot of notes in this Visigothic Bible, also with very punctual notes and very ordinary notes, annotations, as as if the relation with the script was completely different from the Latin world. So you said I deal with the Latin world, I cannot say much about the rest, but I was wondering whether you had the same questions and if you got the same answers. Well, I can say that in the acts of that conference of Verity I was mentioning, Paolo Supino Martini gathered a good amount of manuscripts, cases of dated manuscripts coming from Spain for the early Middle Age. And so it seems that in that environment, the habit to set dates for early Middle Age was more attested. So I didn't include them in the tables I gave you. You don't see Spain in the table. It's not there because we do not have catalogs of dated manuscripts, and so the news are scattered in the catalogs. I should have had to find this data and include them included in the tables, but this data would have not been true. But it is not excluded, so it is likely that this precision was there, this special attention to this fact was there, just as it seems that it is more frequent to see this habit in that environment. I must also, I'm sorry, and then I conclude, I will close my mouth forever. So I have to say that on all these, some material conditions can be found, or the possibility of finding data in manuscripts, because as you've seen, they're often in the first page or in the last page, and so you can understand first and last pages are the ones which are lost at first. And it's concerned early Middle Age and late Middle Age, and so somehow they compensate. I'd like to thank you for the beautiful lecture. I have a question about the lecture by Teresa de Robertis. So I have a curiosity. In the last folio of the handouts, reference is made to the different hands alternating. So out of curiosity, how are they reported? Well, they are names which appear at the end of the section copied by the specific copyist. And they're all written by a single hand. They're not autograph, but probably the head of the scriptorium notes that that part has been written by X and the other part has been written by Y. So this is what happens in these cases of manuscripts copied and distributed among the different copies. The head of the scriptorium does it. And there is also a case of one case of one part which has been commissioned to somebody else. So a part has been commissioned to one copyist, but then there are some notations which allow us to say that that part was fertily divided into other parts.
Is this something that happens often in Tours? I wouldn't know if in Tours that happens often or not. I said there are, but there are not many. In any case, when I mean, with the cases that I have dealt with, there are often names in that position, and they are not of the same hand of the copyist.
Sì, tanto ho la traduzione.
So mention was made of Arabic manuscripts, and there are, of course, also Hebrew manuscripts. Interference. Hebrew manuscripts. Now, I've been working with many manuscripts which could be looked at as copies, but could also be looked at as original compositions. The borderline between copying a text and editing it, rearranging it, laying it out in an original way is not always easy to tell, and surely that must affect the time that it takes for a manuscript to be produced.
Mi scusi, non ho capito bene la domanda.
I didn't understand quite well your question. What do you mean, the original relation between the copy and the original?
Yes, so a lot of Hebrew texts which I work with are copied, of course. Scribes are copying them.
Sì.
But as they copy them, they don't simply copy them. They edit, they modify, they rearrange, all sorts of interventions,
Ho capito.
which mean, I presume, that the work of the copyist must be more elaborate and therefore more time-consuming. So when you measure the time that it takes for a manuscript to be produced, consideration has to be given to the kind of work that was being undertaken by the scribe.
Ho capito, grazie. Grazie.
Now I understood. Okay, this needs to be taken into account. During the copying, there might be the intervention of copies. For example, the text might be edited compared to other models. We have, or at least I, based my research on the dates that I found on the manuscripts in order to calculate the speed at which the manuscript has been copied. This is what either the copyist has declared by saying, I have started in this day and I ended in this day. If you refer to the situations in which I have a text that was ended on a specific day and the other, the following ones, ended another day, that doesn't mean that, for example, the copy must have started to being copied the moment the first text has been copied and the second copy starts immediately. In those cases, and I said it, we somehow proceed by altering a little bit when we have to make this calculation. I mean, we have to insist a little bit. I know, I am perfectly aware. If you are referring instead to those cases when, for example, there is a fragmented copy of the exemplar, in those cases, clearly, maybe for texts that come from such ancient times, such as Livius, I imagine that the intervention of a copyist might be very limited in that case. I don't know if I made myself clear. I don't know, maybe not, but... Can I ask Teresa a question? A few years ago, I found out when I was a student that in the female monastery of Cern, there was, I think, if I remember well, De Civitate, copied in 2 volumes. So one of that must be in Köln by nuns. And in that cases, the files have been transcribed and copied in the same position. I don't know, Tours is not that far away from that monastery. Could it be possible that, given the fact that it might be the same, around the same time, could it be that geographically and chronologically homogeneous as area and chronology? So in that, meaning that in that region of Gaul, and they basically were doing things the same way? Well, Vezin, when he wrote this article on the collaboration between the copyists, take into account this Augustine copied by women, which is a rare event these are the manuscripts that he took into account. He was the specialist of that. This can be found also in other areas. Livio de Laterios is Italian, and also considering this late Middle Age in the Italian territory, there are codices of vulgar literature of the origins copied in this way. Also copies that are very much frequent, not with the idea of copying and making a beautiful code. This codex. This is what I say when I usually say that it would be useful to create an archive, or to write about this. It would be useful. Well, thank you, Teresa, for this answer. If there are no further questions, I would like to thank all the speakers and all the participants, and I will see you tomorrow morning at 9 for the continuation of this the time in writing in the afternoon, arts and cultures. Thank you.